So how do you account for that rapid rise?
Well, I mean, Alex Dumas is just an amazing soldier. And in fact, I mean, there's so many examples, but one from, I like to quote a summary from a memoir that I found of another officer of the time. And I think it's an interesting quote because this other officer, from reading his memoirs, is clear that he is a thoroughgoing racist. He hates blacks. He hates anybody. He actually says that he can't stand to be in the same room as a Negro. And, he gives you all the reasons why. But he says right there in his memoirs, no matter how I may feel about Negroes, yet I must confess, there is this man, Alexander Dumas, and he may be the finest soldier in the world. Anyway, Alex at the time was riding around with these guys on the border, and he just did these incredible things. Basically, he would ride in, and there's the first time he comes in the records is when he, on fairly small scale, he takes 13 prisoners almost single-handedly without firing a shot, gets all of their weapons, marches all the prisoners back, and then donates the weapons to the French Senate.
So I mean, enormous feats of strength, bravery, but how is his leadership skills?
Audacity and leadership. I think this is it. It's not just brave, like the way that he takes prisoners without firing a shot is that he just knows how to psych people out, and he has an incredible sense of when and how to attack, and how to lead men. I mean, he just very, very soon,
a natural leader. He's
a natural leader. Very soon, it's not 13 men or even 500 men, as you started to mention. I mean, he finds himself within 2 years leading 53,000 white French soldiers in some of the most rugged terrain in Europe. They're actually on a glacier in the Alps. And here's a guy who grew up in Haiti, and has never seen snow till, just that, a few years before. I should also say this is a time when the French armies are very dangerous for officers. Dozens of generals are being murdered by their own troops. Alex Dumas only inspires the absolute opposite. He inspires adulation and love from everybody. Their men are willing to follow him almost anywhere.
And you said here was this black man that was leading white troops, and this wouldn't happen again until 200 years later with Colin Powell.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, there are other officers of color, and then there are a few generals in the 20th century, but nobody would rise as high in a white army or in a white majority society as Alex Dumas, in some ways, until our own time. And in some ways, he is really like a precursor for Colin Powell and even for President Obama. I mean, he's really, in many ways, he lived a life in the 18th century, a kind of post-racial, he lived a kind of 21st century life in the 18th century as a post-racial leader in a white society, even though he was black.
We're discussing the book called The Black Count. It's about the father of the novelist Alexander Dumas. Tom Reiss is a best-selling author, and he's in the studio with me. What happens when he meets Napoleon? What are the circumstances, and how do they not get along?
Well, here it becomes almost like a Greek tragedy, a conflict between these two great warriors who are absolutely the opposite in every way. Dumas, this incredible physical leader who leads out in front of his men with courage, audacity, and who inspires his men on this emotional level. And Napoleon, this kind of calculating, quite scheming but brilliant strategist. And in fact, the first time they meet, Dumas outranks Napoleon, and Napoleon asks him for guns because he needs some. And Dumas is, at the time, as I said, he's in the Alps fighting very treacherous conditions, and he actually has a 3-month deadline to take the Alps from France, and he basically sends Napoleon back a note saying, "I'm sorry, I can't spare any guns, my friend." So that's the first I found. I mean, these are, I had to sift through hundreds and actually thousands of these military letters that no one had gone through. And so, when I mention some incident like that, I should say it's because I'm searching through hundreds of letters, and then I suddenly I'm like, well, wait, does this say Napoleon here? And it's actually spelled in this kind of funny way. And is Dumas talking to him as though he's this underling? And it's quite exciting when I found that letter, and I realized that's the first.
But was the animosity from Napoleon because Dumas was so much bigger and better than him, or was it racism?
Well, it's a combination, and it's certainly, I wouldn't say that he was better than him. I mean, they were just very, very different kinds of leaders, obviously. But and anyway, the animosity didn't come from that one incident, that small incident where they first crossed paths. They actually next really got involved with each other during the campaign to liberate Italy from the Austrians, which was a very, very big part of these French Revolutionary Wars. Essentially, it's when this is the beginning of modern Italy. The French sweep into Italy, and with the help of Italian patriots, they throw out these enemy forces, but then there's fierce fighting, and Alex Dumas becomes instrumental to driving the Germans and Austrians up north, back into the mountains, and out of Italy. In fact, Dumas does much of this even though he's a general, he does much of this sort of old style, dragoon style warfare where he'll take small bands. He's almost like a special forces general. And he loves to fight with small groups of men that can use stealth and lots of secret. He likes to use spies and a lot of secret kind of stuff. And he actually gets the Austrians in the hills. And there's a certain point where he has all of them on this bridge, and the Austrians outnumber the French so much that the men that Dumas is leading, even though they're very brave, they all freak out and they run away. And Dumas is left alone on this bridge. And, the records from that day describe him being shot. Horses are shot out from under him. He's being slashed with sabers. Any other man would have fallen. Alex Dumas not only doesn't fall, he fights so hard that by the time reinforcements arrive, the Austrians are just routed and they run. And instead of accepting medical care, Dumas leaps on a horse, and with a couple of guys, he chases the Austrians up towards the Brenner Pass and out of Italy. And at this point in this campaign, Napoleon, even though he's taken a dislike to Dumas, has to acknowledge what a fabulous soldier he is. And so he celebrates him as the reincarnation of the hero who saved Rome from the barbarians by keeping these Germanic forces out. But the reason that Napoleon doesn't like Dumas from the beginning is that Alex Dumas' fatal flaw is really that he can't keep his mouth shut, or that Alex Dumas' fatal flaw is that he speaks his mind no matter what. And he will not be kept down. And so first, this happens in Italy, where he sees Napoleon taking the revolution in a different direction. Basically, Napoleon sees the revolution as a chance to establish his own power. And Dumas he's a red, white, and blue revolutionary. He staked his life on genuine fight for liberty, equality, and fraternity, especially because he has seen what this can do for people of color. This is in his letters. This is everywhere that he
Napoleon
writes.
was kind of more in it for himself.
Napoleon's entirely in it for himself. And then the next year, the two of them go to Egypt, and Napoleon is commanding an expedition to invade Egypt, supposedly to liberate the Egyptians. But Dumas, who goes along as his cavalry commander, is instantly very suspicious of why they're there. And he brings up kind of insurrection among the troops and the generals. I mean, he doesn't cause an insurrection, but he publicly questions Napoleon as the French are losing thousands of men to disease. And he says, I don't think we're really here for the reasons we say we're here. We're here so that you can build up an empire in the desert. And Napoleon cannot tolerate.
Doesn't like that.
Yeah, he doesn't like it, and he can't. It's Napoleon is building up this myth of himself, and here is this big, glamorous man, Dumas.
And Napoleon only comes up to his chest.
The memoirs of Napoleon's doctor on the Egyptian expedition describe what the Egyptians thought when they first saw the French troops marching across the desert to Alexandria. And they saw first they described this incredible tall black man on his horse who was so at one with the horse that he looked like a centaur and he looked like a great hero. And they were sure that this man was the leader of the French expedition.
Not that little guy.
Yes. And then they said the Egyptians described seeing this scrawny little man following him who was Napoleon. And they were sure, well, he has to be some underling. So they clashed from the beginning because of this great discrepancy between them. But then there was also the racial issue.
And, a lot happens. Alex Dumas is captured after he leaves Egypt and spends time in prison. But Napoleon really essentially takes power in France, becomes a dictator, and then completely rolls back all of these racial equality laws.
Yes. And, well, I should just say that Alex Dumas doesn't only spend time in prison. It's really a dungeon. And, in fact, in that safe that we spoke about at the beginning that I found so many important records to write this book. Probably the most important record in the safe was a description written in Dumas' own hand, in Alex Dumas' own hand, of his imprisonment in this dungeon. And it was that description that his son, the novelist, would use as an inspiration to write the beginning of The Count of Monte Cristo. So it's kind of for somebody who's a Dumas fan, was a remarkable document to be holding in my hand.
But, you alluded to this earlier where he kind of rose to the top and then, fell really to the bottom. When he went
Absolutely.
back to France, there's all these racial laws now that were, black and white people can't get married, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that is, I didn't mean to deflect from that with the dungeon. The dungeon is really the personal tragedy that happens to Dumas, where he's being poisoned and he's sort of out of the picture for 2 years. And as you say, when he comes back to France, a mere 2 years later, Napoleon has imposed this dictatorship. And what people don't know is that Napoleon's dictatorship was largely financed by the sugar and slave traders. And there's incredible money poured in. Essentially, it's like a political PAC. And one of the deals they are trying to get and clearly get is the reimposition of slavery and the end of this post-racial society, which has been, costing them money. When Dumas gets back to France, he suddenly finds this country that had a mere couple of years before had integrated the world's first integrated school system in Paris, and the head of the French Senate was black, and there were a lot of mixed race and black legislators. Napoleon has kicked all of them out, and there were a lot of blacks in officers in the army. Dumas was by far the highest, but there were others. And Napoleon actually passes laws kicking them out of the army, essentially putting anybody who has black or African heritage into the equivalent of chain gangs. They set up deportation camps. They create a zone around Paris that no person of color is allowed to live in. Of course, Alex Dumas' house in that little village happens to be within that zone. So I found this very, heart-rending letter that he had to write, essentially asking for a dispensation from the racial law, even though he was one of France's great heroes, one of the great heroes of the revolution. He has to get a special permission to live in his own house. They've banned mixed marriages. And of course, Dumas' sweetheart and his love of his life, Marie-Louise, is white. And so he's living almost illegally for that reason. And, in every way, it's just this tragic reversal.
What's your next book going to be about?
I think I've gotten kind of addicted to heroes, and I can't say what it is, but I'm looking into another kind of great unsung hero. And I go for stories that have a certain kind of bittersweet quality about them and that expose the kind of underbelly of history, but I always have to find some kind of inspiration in it. So like in this story, no matter how bad things got at the end, I am so deeply inspired by the fact that out of all of this, even in this tragic period we're talking about, Alex Dumas had a son, and that son, seeing his father wronged, pushed out of history, decided, I'm going to write him back in as these great heroes that we know today as the Count of Monte Cristo and the Three Musketeers. So I'm always looking for the combination of the two things.
Tom Reiss is a best-selling author. The book is The Black Count, Glory, Revolution, Betrayal, and the Real Count of Monte Cristo. It's published by Crown Books. Tom, thanks so much for being on the program.
Hey, thanks. Great questions, Mimi.